Natalia Rojas. I work for Aquatera, an environmental company based in Stromness, Orkney Island, Scotland. IMEC and Heriot-Watt University are based in Stromness too, and we have been collaborating together since 2001. So basically, Aquatera has been involved in the marine renewable energy sector since 2001, and we have developed more than 200 studies in the blue economy. So just to start with the WEP project, basically this project was funded through the Oceanera Net Co-Fund in 2017 by a Scottish enterprise. We have 4 partners, Plocan, Puerto de las Palmas, Aquatera and Heriot-Watt University, which Universidad de La Laguna and Universidad de Las Palmas have been supporting the project too. The total budget of the project was 1 million euros. And basically, we tried to design an energy storage system for a wave technology developer, which is WEP Global, and tested in the port of Las Palmas. Basically, Aquatera was developing 3 research lines. The first one was to design a cost-effective methodology for wave technologies installation and recovery. The second one was the biofouling research that we will explain in this presentation. And the last one, it was basically to design an LCOE model for wave technologies installation around the world. Can we move to the next one, please? Yes, so just a brief introduction about the problem that we have with biofouling and marine renewable energy technologies. Biofouling is a problem for any industry from the blue economy putting their structures in the sea. However, there are some specific issues regarding biofouling in the marine renewable energy industry. Here in this slide, you can see different types of technologies. We are talking today just about wave technologies because the WEP project was about point absorber technology from WEP Global. You can see there are some examples of some of the principles for capturing energy from waves. The first one is a point absorber, which is the same principle that WEP Global uses, and then we have oscillating wave surge and an attenuator. We should include also components because apart from these moving parts of the technology, there are subsea cables and connectors that they also suffer the consequences for biofouling. So basically, biofouling creates an important drag and an impact on the energy capture system of these technologies, increasing the weight and the roughness. Also, it accelerates, obviously, the corrosion of the technology and all the components and the infrastructure. Basically, installing these devices in the sea, it may create a stepping stone for the spread of fouling communities, native and not native ones. Can we please move to the next one? So why biofouling is so important in the blue energy sector? So there are new components that has been used in this sector, and they are tried and tested in the sea. Also, we need to think that devices are installed in conditions that are a bit unknown, like, for example, tidal devices that are installed in current with more than 2 meters per second speed. So that's an environment that is not very well known. Depending on the technologies, the hydrodynamic and mechanical consequences of biofouling in their moving parts are a big concern. I think that we can move to the next one then. Yeah, so Heriot-Watt has been leading the biofouling research line of the WEP project. Basically, the overall aim is to minimize the fouling and corroding impacts of marine organisms in the blue energy technologies and the infrastructure. So basically, we design and manufacture a test array for panels. In total, we had a structure for 48 panels, that's the capacity, and we were replacing these panels every 3 months. Andrew will get into details later. The structure was installed in Santa Cruz de Tenerife in the concession from Universidad de La Laguna. That was in July 2020, and we have been doing since this research until now. Originally, the idea was to install this in Ploucan, but in the University of Las Palmas, the logistics to get and replace the panels and so on, it was easier. So we decided to partnership with Universidad de La Laguna. So basically, we wanted to understand the issues of fouling in the Canaries. So also considering that ICIT has been doing this research in other countries, we wanted to compare and have like an idea of the different regional conditions. The anti-fouling products that were tested were provided by the Australian government, particularly the Department of Defense. We should thank Richard Piola that has provided, and they sent the panels to the Canary Islands, and also to Copper Code, thanks to Jason Kenny for sending the panels from the UK too, to be tested here. Also, I would like to say thank you to Universidad de Las Palmas, to Pilar and Juanjo. Universidad de Las Palmas has been supporting us with the fouling analysis. And finally, I would like to say thank you to Universidad de La Laguna, to Ricardo Souto and Javier, that they have been supporting us with all this deployment in their concession in Santa Cruz, Tenerife. I think that I leave the floor now to Andrew. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia. That was fantastic. I want to move on a little bit with the presentation and go to some more details. So as Natalia mentioned, I'm with Heriot-Watt University, and the main campus is in Edinburgh, but we have a campus where I am, which is in Orkney off the north coast of Scotland. And this area is very important for the testing and development of marine renewable energy devices. It's home to the European Marine Energy Centre, and also within the same campus is where Natalia main office is at Aquatera. We're talking about wave energy specifically, but in the broader scope of what we mean by offshore renewable energy, this slide shows a few examples here of what we're talking about. So a wave device is the one found in the middle lower here, the Wello device. But included amongst what we call offshore renewable energy includes tidal devices. Here in the upper left is the world's largest tidal turbine, which is currently in Orkney waters, produced by Orbital Marine Power. The most developed currently is offshore wind sector. And I should also mention there are some other technologies such as floating photovoltaic energy as well. Here's a picture of me on top of the world's largest tidal turbine recently. The reason why we're having offshore renewable energy is because we have a societal and governmental goal, of course, to try to decarbonize our electricity generation. But there is a fairly simplistic relationship. I've drawn this incredibly simplistic pattern of the relationship between biofouling and offshore renewable energy. And quite simply, offshore renewable energy structures influence fouling by providing a substrate. And of course, biofouling influences offshore renewable energy by having impacts upon it. So very briefly, from a technological perspective, fouling is a significant problem. And from a technological perspective, there's a very simple solution to that. Well, I should say, no, a very simple wish list to that, and that is to not have biofouling. Obviously, that's the main goal from a biofouling mitigation standpoint, from a technology perspective. But I want to talk a little bit about from the ecological perspective and relationship with the remit of GloFouling, for example, is that from a biofouling, from an ecological perspective, it gets a little bit more complicated, because when you provide a substrate for something to grow on, in this image here on the upper right, we have an invasive, a non-native sea squirt. So that's something that we don't want to be on our structure. So we call that biofouling particularly. But on the bottom right, we have something else which will settle and grow onto a hard substrate. In this case, it's a cold water coral, which is a priority marine feature. So we want this to be growing there. So there is actually sometimes a complicated relationship between things that grow, whether we want them to be there or not want them to be there. So from an ecological perspective, what are the impacts of biofouling on offshore renewable energy? Well, one of the main impacts is that they may form a stepping stone, which facilitates populations moving from one area to the other. And again, is that good? Is it bad? Well, you know, if it's, for example, these priority cold water corals, maybe it's a good thing. I don't know. But in addition to having structures allowing the movement of species, we also, of course, have service vessels going back and forward from harbors to these devices, which may also, of course, increase risk of transfer of potentially nuisance species. Some potentially positive things also, there is an enhancement of biodiversity by putting an additional hard substrate into another, otherwise what might be a homogeneous soft sediment area. If you put a hard substrate in, you may increase the biodiversity. You can also increase sequestration of blue carbon with certain types of organisms growing on structures. Nutrient cycling is affected as well. So there is a lot of things going on, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but I just wanted to say that there is a body of literature out there forming on the effects of biofouling and non-native species movements in the offshore renewable energy sector. It's not a huge literature at this time, so I just wanted to highlight a few studies and just make some sort of key points of where we are right now. A study by Corson and Gill has identified the various ecosystem services that are created by offshore wind farms, and just notes that this is both complex. Some of these services may be positive or negative impacts from the offshore renewable energy, and the magnitude and extent remain quite unclear. A lot of work's been done in the North Sea by Koelen in the Netherlands, and so, for example, this study of the non-native caprellid, Caprella mutica, suggested that its spread is not so much for these offshore deep water structures, but rather near shore, closer to harbor areas, in surface waters as well. Work by Danheim in 2019, also looking at wind farms and what impacts these may have on the marine ecology, has suggested that these may pose some risk for the movement of non-native species. That these communities are more impoverished relative to natural hard substrates, and that there are differences in the substrate type. So concrete, for example, has more biodiversity than steel structures. And then the last one to mention here, Viola, has a very interesting study done in California, I believe. And this was looking at the idea of removing fouling can actually increase space availability, which in some cases may enhance the spread of certain non-native species. So it may be that the timing of scheduling might be an important mitigation strategy. So just a couple of real general observations to make. Firstly, artificial substrates may enhance biodiversity, but that of course may include invasive non-native species. The risk of non-native species is greatest in marinas and harbors, and it may be restricted to surface waters and to surface piercing components of the ore sector, and again, may be less common associated with this there may be hydrographic barriers preventing non-native species in offshore renewable energy devices. As Viola has mentioned, informed scheduling of biofouling removal may be a valuable tool in mitigating fouling impacts, including the establishment of non-native species. But many knowledge gaps exist in relationship with the offshore renewable energy. So for example, as Natalia pointed out, we're looking at very high energy areas that haven't previously been studied as much. We're looking at novel materials. We're looking at devices that have different niche areas, these new technologies. Also, biofouling characterization is very varied around the world. Some areas are very well known, very well characterized. Other global areas are much more poorly studied. So overall, the risk of the potential spread of INNS through ore is not well known. I want to make a recommendation that there's a great overall report of the role of marine renewable energy and the relationship with the environment here. And in chapter 6, specifically, there's a section on the changes of benthic habitats associated with offshore renewable energy. And so that features a section on biofouling. So for those of you interested in biofouling and offshore renewable energy, that's a very good sort of starter area. But now I want to talk a little bit more about the WEP Plus project itself. Here's an introductory slide. There's Natalia there, enjoying the warm weather of Tenerife. Just to put in context of the map here, we're up in Orkney on the far right. And of course, Tenerife is much, much further south off the African coast. The study involved 2 depths. Each depth was had a pair of frames which contained an array of panels. These panels, as Natalia has already as mentioned, were provided very kindly to us by the Australian government's Department of Defence, Science and Technology, and by Coppercoat. The panels from the Australian government were PCL panels, a control with no microbicide, microbicide, and one with microbicide. And then Coppercoat was the other panels of use. Now, this study has only just ended. We've only just taken the panels out, so there hasn't been the chance to do a detailed analysis. So what I'm about to show you is some very, very, very preliminary graphs. So please be patient with me. And we'll try to get further details to you in the coming weeks. So just some very, very preliminary results here, and nothing earth-shaking about what I'm about to show you on this slide. This is showing the upper panels and the lower panels, looking at it from a percent cover of macroalgae fouling. Unsurprisingly, there is a small difference in that there is a little bit less macrofouling in the deeper water, which I guess makes sense because it's a little bit deeper, so there's a little bit less photic energy. But it also makes sense that it's a very small difference because it's a very small difference in the depth, and it's not statistically significant. The graph on the right here is showing panels that have been immersed for different lengths of time. There are approximately 100-day intervals here, and quite simply, it's showing that after about 100 days, approximately 80% of the cover of the panels, the panels were covered by approximately 80% of macrofouling after 100 days, and as it progressed through, it became more full of macrofouling, approaching 100%. But again, that's nothing. It just means it becomes more fouled over time. Again, nothing particularly earth-shattering about that. However, we do have some more, a little bit more to show you. Here's the performances of the 3 different materials. So overall macrofouling, again, quite high on the controls. Very, very little on the PCL, which had the microbicide. And then the Coppercoat functioned quite well here. Looking at specifically at macroalgae, it appears that the Coppercoat is better from macrofauna prevention rather than macroalgae. The microbicide was very effective here. And then lastly, we also looked at the thickness of this. And again, we see again the same sort of general pattern. There is some thickness associated with the treated panels, and this is a mucilage, some sort of a microscopic type of bacterial film on there. As far as the macro fouling species, these are 4 representative ones of some of the main species. There was also a great abundance of the green algae ulva, some bryozoans, and a few hydroids. Of note, Colpomenia and Balanus trigonus are both non-native species to these waters. So that's kind of interesting in its own regard. So a few comments on the preliminary statements about this study that we've concluded and writing up now. These studies, of course, are important to identify biofouling communities in the ore sector. The INNS are present here as dominant fouling organisms, so these non-native species. We have found that the dominant species here are quite different from ones we found in other studies in other parts of the world. We found that the PCL panels were the most effective, the ones that were treated with the microbicide. However, we found these panels were a little bit difficult to work with because they have a very low melting temperature, could be quite tacky to touch, and were found to be quite brittle. Mentioned previously, the copper coat appeared to be more effective against macrofauna. We plan to expand these studies to look at high energy waters in Las Canarias, in the Canary Islands, and we expect that offshore there'll be different fouling communities, both from the sheltered area and also from cooler waters previously studied. So to go to some of the previous studies, I want to very just quickly, briefly go over some findings from the BioFree project, which looked at which has worked with international test centers and the development of a novel system for deployment. I'm not going to go into any detail here. This is just simply just to say that we've done similar types of studies looking at successional changes, and we found that the types of organisms in the cooler Atlantic waters of around Orkney and in the North Sea are a different type of organisms. Usually it's a turf of hydroids that are the initial fouling organisms. You also get tube-forming amphipods a lot. And I guess the key point is that it's very critical that you have local knowledge of what fouling is going on, because it can be very varied depending upon what location you are. So where these technologies are placed can be quite important in what sort of fouling you'd be expecting to get. Part of the BioFree project looks at other areas. There is some preliminary data from Japanese waters. So very similarly, there is similar in the sense of that it is different. This is much more of a barnacle dominated early succession found in Japanese waters. And of interest here, we also have that same species, Balanus trigonus. In this case, though, it's a native here, whereas it's an invasive species in Tenerife. Just very, very briefly, we've in the studies conducted in Orkney waters, we've identified over 200 species. 7 of those are non-natives. We're able to analyze and plot the different communities, and they cluster around different hydrodynamic conditions, so high wave versus high tidal versus more sheltered environments. And so by identifying the main species and the main fouling species and when they settle, we are suggesting that an important mitigation against the impacts of fouling, and this was corroborated with the work that Danheim did, is to suggest that timing of maintenance may be very effective as a method for mitigating the spread of biofouling, nuisance species included. Specifically talking about invasive non-native species in our own studies. Again, there are 7 species that have been found. None of these have been recorded at full scale offshore renewable energy sites. So possibly these sites are, again, conditions that don't allow, maybe there are hydrographic barriers that prevent these types of species from spreading. But our studies also discovered a new non-native to our area, Styla clava, which is a real problem in large parts of the world. We recently have discovered this in Orkney, and in fact have extended the range in Scottish waters 170 kilometers further north. So I just want to end now with one final sort of overall concept of putting this in the offshore renewable energy in the context of the GloFouling project. And that's to say that there is, the reason why we're discussing this, of course, is that there are some possibility of this concept of stepping stones being formed by these structures. So I first want to say that there's obviously an awful lot of stuff already in, for example, the North Sea. In this diagram here, it's showing oil and gas in blue and shipwrecks in black. And what we're seeing right now, of course, in the next few years, the next few decades, is we're going to be getting more and more installations of offshore floating wind, fixed wind, tidal devices, wave devices, floating photovoltaic, etc. And around the world in areas where there hasn't previously been oil and gas installations, for example. At the same time as these new installations, we're going to be getting decommissioning. We are getting decommissioning of oil and gas platforms, as well as potentially derogation where they're choosing to remain in place or being allowed to remain in place. So there's a complex balance going on between putting new structures in and again, potentially creating a network of substrates. So to that end, there's a project called Insight, funded by NERC and CFAS in the UK, which is looking at trying to understand better this connectivity. And they've funded 7 projects. So I just want to end by saying that one of these projects is recently funded. It's been led by Heriot-Watt Orkney. And it's the main project that I'm working on at the moment with colleagues there. It involves several important partners: the National Oceanography Centre, University of Hull, Natural History Museum, University of Aberdeen, and Natalia and her colleagues and over at Aquatera as well. So I just want to finally end with some acknowledgements and big thanks. Thank you to my colleagues at Heriot-Watt and other colleagues at Aquatera. Thank you to GloFouling. Thank you to John and Maria for organizing today's conference webinar. Thanks to our funders, Scottish Enterprise, Ocean Energy, NERC. Thank you to the coating suppliers and other people who've helped out as well. And very much thank you to you, our audience, for tuning in today. And so I'm just going to leave this last slide up here, which gives contact details for Natalia and myself. And I think we are happy to field any questions.